Good morning, and welcome to this panel where we're going to talk about how to address climate change globally, and can we do it without close cooperation. We have a great panel this morning. Who's Yukon Wong from Carnegie Endowment, Dr. Ernie Moniz, I don't think I need to introduce, and you're probably doctor too, Chris Knittel from MIT. And we're going to dive very quickly into this topic. We thought that most of the conversation will be to understand how the China-US relationship impact climate, but we're not going to only talk about the US-China relationship. We'll try to look more globally at this issue. But let's start there. Can we have significant advance in global climate policy if the US and China are not on the same page? Yukon, let's start with you.
Well, let me talk about it from a China perspective. If I were asked what are the three major factors that would influence climate change from a US-China perspective, I would say one is about building trust. Without trust between the major powers, you cannot achieve these goals because you have commitments that have to be met and they have to be intensified. Second, you have to have technological exchange of information. If you don't have it in many areas, you're going to have to be much more efficient. You have to have new technologies, and you have to exchange information. And third, you need more money in this world. Nobody has enough money. So what do we know about the US-China tensions? Trust is totally gone. I don't think it's going to come back in the foreseeable future. The second actually is really fundamental. We've been able to achieve our goals so far because of knowledge exchange across countries. It's not just trade about products and goods and people and finance. It's about information and new techniques. And US policy in that regard is basically closing this off. I think it's very serious. The third about finance is also country specific. We know the problems in the United States about the budget deficits and financing. But China, which has been growing in the past at very significant rates, is going through a major growth slowdown. It's slowly going bankrupt in many ways. Pressing concern, security, finance. So how can it find the trillions of dollars to basically go into climate change initiatives? The answer is this is going to be a major challenge. Let me just stop right there.
Well, let me say, first of all, I agree with the first and third points. I think on the trust issue, there's every reason to believe, in my view, that there will be a continuing drift apart, frankly, into more like a separation of geopolitical interests, with, of course, large parts of the world staying as neutral as they can in that. But I don't see that improving. I agree. The third point, I also agree that China is clearly trying to balance many issues economically with its political aspirations, and there are certainly weaknesses in the house of cards that I think you referred to. However, on the second one, I don't believe that what you call the technology sharing, technology exchange is particularly going to increase. I think it's also going to go in the opposite direction, but I'm not so sure that that is essential for the overall global climate progress. In fact, I think China and the United States and just about every other country are at some level going to have shared objectives as extreme weather more and more drives the publics around the world to understand that while we may dearly love our children and grandchildren, we really love to address the impact that we are feeling today in terms of economic and social and other kinds of harms. So I don't see that second element being one of great progress, but I also don't see it as being the core reason why we cannot progress in addressing climate.
Good.
Yeah, I want to go back to your original question, which was, can we meet our climate goals without cooperation? I think what is often confused is we often talk about two goals. We have domestic goals and we have global goals, whether it's 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. We can certainly meet our domestic goals, decarbonization goals, without much cooperation. In fact, the Inflation Reduction Act is moving in the opposite direction in the sense that we now have domestic content requirements. We're legislating less cooperation, if you will, from that perspective. But to meet the global goals of whatever your favorite temperature change is, it's going to be very difficult without the two most polluting nations having some cooperation. And what I find fascinating, building off of Ernie's last point, is that we have now framed addressing climate change as a jobs technology, in a jobs technology way, rather than focusing on the actual environmental issues that are being generated by that. So at some point we're going to have to come back, because that's where the cooperation is going to come from. The fact that climate change is bad for the world, as opposed to we can create jobs in one country. At that point it becomes more like a zero-sum game than anything else.
Could I just add a comment that, again, no one is questioning the need for a global response to achieve overall climate goals. I just think that the words cooperation are often stretched beyond what we can actually expect.
Yukon, I want to come back to you with what the IRA does into trying to create an industrial base here, a new supply chain. How is China reacting to that, and how its energy policy is shifting or not because of the change in the system? Is it going to make it even more difficult for China to achieve its own climate goals?
Well, if you followed Xi Jinping's speech last night at the so-called two sessions, for the first time, he actually talks explicitly about tensions with the U.S. Before, it was always nebulous, the West or others. He actually mentioned the United States by name for the first time. And he sees U.S. policies as the policies of containment, suppression, of growth. If you go back to 2017, when's the last time that Xi made a major pronouncement on climate change, he actually came forward with a statement that China might be willing to play a leadership role. That's unusual. China usually doesn't. It likes to stay in the background. But the tenor has actually changed over the last 3 or 4 years, partly the U.S.-China tensions, partly because of the growth slowdown. And you have a conflict between, I call, China's objective. Xi Jinping's objective is to make China a major innovative power by 2035. So where does climate change come into that? China has 2 climate change targets, 2030, 2060. Peak emissions, carbon neutrality. So the issue for China, for Xi Jinping, is balancing the growth objective against these climate change objectives. And he sees the tensions in the United States making that very difficult. Let me just mention, he has to balance the growth objective of 2035. By the way, that's when he thinks he actually will stay in power, not just 5 years, but another 15. By then he'll be the same age as President Biden, by the way, okay? And then he has the 2030 and 2060 climate change objectives. And now he has COVID. COVID basically slowed down the growth significantly, and you will see that in the last 2 or 3 years, Xi Jinping has been tempering China's willingness to stretch and meet these longer-term climate change objectives.
I would just add that without obviously calling it the same thing, China has had the infrastructure law and IRA long before the United States had them, just by a different name. And I would add that in the United States, of course, we saw a stunning set of legislative advances in less than a year: the infrastructure law, the CHIPS Science Act, and the IRA. By any impolite name, this is called industrial policy. It is amazing how bipartisanship has crept into industrial policy in a strong way. And obviously China, and it's not the only, but it's been a major impetus behind bipartisan industrial policy. I would argue that those laws created a very, very strong foundation for moving ahead in the competition with China, in addressing climate change, et cetera. But frankly, it's going to come down to implementation. And I think that has been a barely disguised theme in remarks that we have heard yesterday.
Yeah, but can we also say that in the near term, anyway, the IRA has a China problem? Because if you want to accelerate deployment in the United States, you need to import a lot of the equipment from China. So there's an inner contradiction, at least in the beginning, that the IRA has a China problem, because you would need to increase.
I agree, but I think unfortunately the conversation has devolved into a pretty kind of black and white conversation, whereas I think the real conversation and the appropriate, I believe, domestic U.S. policy, as is European policy developing, et cetera, is about the reality is for decades we have not paid sufficient attention to supply chain hygiene. And I don't mean China, Russia, et cetera. I mean management of supply chains, to have resilience. I don't believe it's about everything being domestic. That's nonsense. But it is about sophisticated and policy-led supply chain hygiene. And that's what we need to do.
Yeah, and I want to just be clear. When I say that the IRA was moving to create an environment that might be more at odds with China than it had been in the past, there's a delicate balance here. We need to play both global and domestic politics. And to play the domestic politics side, we're not likely to get large climate change bills passed unless we focus on the domestic benefits of those large climate bills. And that's where the IRA and the CHIP Act is playing. But we just need to be cognizant of the fact that might shift things on the global scale in terms of negotiations. And you're exactly right in terms of the transition from fossil fuels to electric batteries or hydrogen or other technologies. If you look at the mineral concentrations of the minerals required for that transition, they're more concentrated than fossil fuels. You look at where they're processed, even more concentrated than that. So from an energy security standpoint going forward, we are going to require some incentives to bring those minerals or that processing back to, or at least diversify where that is taking place.
But Chris, I was just going to say, I agree with what you said, Chris, but don't forget, necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah, sure.
Seeing that put various elements in surprising places that were not being exploited before.
We haven't been
rare
looking
earths
for
in
them.
Sweden
Yeah,
and
exactly.
cobalt in the United States, and
Right.
et cetera. So I think it's about hygiene. It's not about crisis in terms of the supply chains.
Let me just add something from a China perspective. It's quite logical for us in the United States to say we need a domestic industry to produce renewables. We need to bring the capacity here. We need to develop the commodities essential for that and the technology. And so the protectionist elements of the IRA Act has logic. America must have this capacity. Now, China, when it developed its solar and wind and other activities 10, 15 years ago from scratch, also wanted to develop a domestic capacity. But I would say the big difference, and they had protectionist policies too, the big difference in China's approach was the recognition that in developing a domestic capacity, it had to be internationally competitive because China's objective was to be able to sell these things abroad. Whereas the American objective is to develop a capacity to generate more jobs. Here, China had that also, but China also said, I need to make use of foreign technology and components if it changes dramatically the cost structure. Because if I don't get that, I cannot sell this abroad. And I think that's the difference between the IRA approach and the Chinese approach. The IRA approach is basically doesn't focus enough on saying, can I be internationally competitive? And what does that mean? As opposed to saying, I want a domestic capacity here in the U.S.
If I could just reinforce that and say that I think, frankly, in the United States discussion, we seldom hear enough credit given. China, for example, manufactures good products, which is what you're saying. And they may have not had exactly the same rule set that we had, but that's the way it is. So I think I agree with you, and I think it's about establishing, again, good, resilient supply chains while addressing those issues of global economics.
Yeah, I want to come back to the supply chain, and you frame it as being hygiene, but in a way what we're seeing is more than that. It's the ability to create a new supply chain for new technology which bypasses China and goes, from Australia through the United States and in between. And I think that also is clearly perceived as in this movement of deglobalization, and potentially created an energy security for China itself. And that perception, I think, now is much clearer in the last year than before.
Well, first of all, I don't think there's any realistic discussion of so-called bypassing China. China is going to be integral to global commerce and global supply chains. That doesn't change the fact that it's no different from Germany's natural gas dependence on Russia. Diversification, security of supply matters. It doesn't mean you have a completely domestic supply chain. It just means that you have the flexibility to respond, whether it is intentional or unintentional acts that interrupt supply chains. And I think that's where we're going. We're right now, I think, in the very early stages of this discussion. And as Chris said, for example, this is a little bit different but related, take the IRA. Without a lot of those domestic political provisions, there would be no IRA. In fact, I would argue that going to the European complaints about IRA, Europe needed the IRA. It's what's causing them to relook at things like state aid rules that was somewhat ossified in my humble view. So I think we're at the beginning of a conversation, and we have to help guide it to and hope it ends up with a much healthier set of global trade relationships, global supply chain relationships, in which no one is really exposed to either, again, intentional or accidental major disruptions. That's the ideal.
Combine the last two comments by Yukon and Ernie. There's certainly components of the IRA that, so from a simple economist perspective, one way to rephrase what Yukon mentioned is that the IRA in many ways will increase the cost of some of these products as opposed to reducing the cost through technology transfer, which is what China has focused on before. There are components of that will do that, the domestic content requirements for one. But there are also a whole suite of subsidies that are going to likely reduce the cost significantly of these technologies. And I actually expect to see WTO challenges of the IRA at some point for the same WTO type challenges that have happened with China in the past. So there are components within the IRA that will motivate or incentivize the export of these products from the U.S.
I think we can't let the tyranny of economists go unchecked.
You never do, Ernie.
One of my most pejorative phrases is academic economist.
Wait, not Chris didn't come through the microphone.
But I think, again, the only thing I'm pointing out, Chris, is costs are higher. Well, costs are higher, a little bit higher maybe now, but costs need to take a much bigger view because one disruption is extremely expensive. And that's where hygiene and resilience comes in and should be part of your calculation of cost.
I wanted to come back a little bit to Europe. We just tangentially mentioned Europe. But clearly Europe plans that how they were thinking post-Russia invasion to reframe their energy sector, what was derailed in a way by the IRA, and to think about their long-term solution, they needed to come to terms with what the IRA does and how much subsidies. And I think, I mean, from my understanding, in December when President Macron came to the US, that was pretty much on top of the agenda. Like, we can't deal with such level of subsidy, and the message was like, that's not going to change, so go do the same. And in a way, what we're pushing here is this industrial, I wouldn't say war, but to a certain degree, really competition between China, Europe, and the United States, and how much it decarbonize versus uncooperatively versus cooperatively. I mean, does it just slow everything, or we have different races going in many different directions?
Well, so I think it can go either way, right? So in essence, what we're might be setting up is a technology arms race. And look, if we start subsidizing, if everybody starts subsidizing green technologies, they're likely to be adopted more quickly. That's the price mechanism. So from that perspective, it might speed up things. But that comes at a cost, potentially inefficiencies generated by heavy subsidies. We'll at some point probably have potentially a carbon border adjustment subsidy scheme as opposed to just an untaxed carbon scheme. So we might start to see quid pro quo in the battle of policies on top of additional policies.
I'm going to be optimistic, but also have a caution on that. I mean, again, I think, I repeat, I think we are at the very early stages of this conversation, and I find Europe's reaction to the IRA, for example, trending very positively, actually, in terms of what ultimately is going to be, at least among allies and friends, and that gets us back to where China and Russia are, but certainly among allies and friends, I think we are going to see a lot more sensible convergence towards how supply chains are viewed as being stable. On the other hand, we cannot be complacent. We can't be complacent about it because there are so many tools that can be employed to put sand in the gears. Just give you one example. Just in the United States, the infrastructure law and the IRA have completely different definitions of clean hydrogen. And now, if you compare those definitions, I don't believe either of them lines up with any definition anywhere else in the world. Well, you can't have an efficient market formation when your standards for what's clean hydrogen are all over the map, let alone finding a way with China, for example. I mean, that would be an example of cooperation that I would, you would like to see happening, some standardization around those definitions to allow a market to form.
Yeah. We have a few more questions, but I wanted to ask you a question because at the end of the day, this is the most important decarbonization piece is coal in China. Does this global environment slow down or accelerate or changes at all the direction of coal consumption in China?
Coal has always been the biggest issue for China. 2000, it accounted for 70% of the total energy needs in China. Today it's 55. If China is going to meet the climate change targets, that 55 has to come down to about 30 to 25. In the US, when we talk about getting rid of coal, we talk about using more oil or gas. The problem in China is that to get the oil and gas, they don't have it at home. They have to import it. So they got a problem. Either they increase their dependency on Russia or the Middle East, and that's not attractive on that. Or it's going to be nuclear renewables. So renewables have got to pick up. And renewables are going very rapidly in China, but could you actually double the pace? Because that's the key. You have to double the pace in China, which is already very, very rapid, to reduce coal. Let me make one last comment about supply chains. What do we know about supply chain shifts in the last 2 to 3 years from the U.S.-China trade war, the IRA, the Ukraine crisis? What you see is U.S.-China trade has not changed, actually. It's more or less the same deficit, the same import values. What here we see in the United States is a sudden increase in imports of renewables and others from basically Mexico and Vietnam, okay? And half of that coming in from Mexico and Vietnam are actually Chinese companies switching the production to those countries to get around the tariff. The second thing you see is dramatic increase in imports and exports of carbon and fossil fuels between Europe and the United States. And that's because now Asia is focusing on Russia. Europe now has to focus on the United States. And the problem with this kind of a switch, it increases costs for everybody. So I think this is going to be a major problem in the future. The restructured supply chains makes it much more difficult.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm asked to make a closing here. What I heard in a way is we're going to stay in a dependent world, is diverging, is going to be more expensive, but there's areas of competition which would bring costs and potentially accelerate. But it's going to be bumpy, and the divorce is not a divorce between the US and China. It's more like disputes for the moment. Thank you very much, and I hope you had a good half-hour discussion, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.
I'm not sure that.
Thank you so much on behalf of your board.
Thank you.
I'm not sure that China
I can take it or you can leave it on your seat.
Thank you. I think a lot depends on how all this Ukraine stuff comes out.